A single spark of arrogance can ignite a chain of events that no one expects. And what should have been nothing more than a quiet Saturday in a crowded mall became the stage for a confrontation that shook everyone who witnessed it. A clash between a child's fragile courage and a man's mocking authority that twisted until the truth arrived in a way no one could deny. Watch closely as this story unfolds. Hit like if it grips you, subscribe for more stories, and share your thoughts about the plot in the comments along with where you're watching from, because your perspective gives these moments their power. She bent over a stack of Nike shoeboxes, flipping the lid open and shut while Madison tugged at the laces of a display pair, joking about which one of them could run faster if they wore them. Their laughter rose easily above the background hum of shoppers moving between aisles, carts rattling, music pulsing softly through overhead speakers. Imani's voice was relaxed when she explained that her mother wouldn't be picking her up until later because she was finishing up at Fort Bragg. She's in Special Forces, so sometimes her schedule's unpredictable, Imani said, tossing the words out like they were as normal as describing what she had for breakfast. Madison froze for a second, staring with wide eyes. Wait, your mom? Like in the army? For real? Imani nodded, sliding the box back into place with a grin she tried to hide. Yeah, she's Sergeant Major Angela Walker. She just got back from a mission overseas. She said it with ease because it was her truth, a truth she'd grown up with, a truth that defined her pride in silence, even when others didn't know. To her, it wasn't bragging, it was simply sharing who her mother was, the same way kids talked about dads fixing cars or moms working at hospitals. But as those words left her lips, she felt a subtle shift around her. The aisle wasn't crowded, but people had a way of tuning in when something unusual was said. A mother pushing a cart with a toddler slowed down near the racks of socks, her head angled as if pretending to browse, but her ears bent toward the girls. Two teenagers in hoodies by the jerseys chuckled softly and glanced at each other as if sharing a private joke. Imani's cheeks flushed under their sudden attention, but she lifted her chin anyway. Her mother was exactly what she had said, and there was nothing wrong with telling the truth. Still, she noticed the way Madison blinked again, whispering, "That's so cool. She's like a real soldier? Actually fighting." "Yeah," Imani replied. Her voice steady though her heart swelled with pride. "She's the strongest person I know. She leads missions, she trains others, and she still comes home and makes me pancakes when she can. She's not just a soldier. She's my mom." Madison smiled in awe, and Imani felt a small glow in her chest, the kind that comes when someone else finally sees your world with the same respect you do. But that glow was fragile, and it was about to be shattered. Just a few feet away stood Officer Daniel Harris, a white man in his 40s dressed casually in jeans and a Carolina Panthers t-shirt. His badge, clipped to his belt, gleamed like a subtle reminder of authority even though he was off duty. Harris had been flipping through a rack of Under Armour hoodies when the words "Special Forces" caught his ear. At first, his mouth twitched, but then the smirk spread fully across his face, and soon the laugh came, sharp, cutting, and louder than it needed to be. It wasn't the soft chuckle of a man overhearing kids exaggerate. It was the mocking laugh of someone certain he had caught a lie. The sound sliced through the aisle, drawing more glances, pulling the quiet focus of everyone who had half been listening already. Imani stiffened, her hands tightening on the shoebox as she turned toward him. Harris leaned casually against the rack like he was enjoying a show, shaking his head as though the humor were too much to bear. "Special Forces? Come on, kid," he said, his voice full of condescension. "I've been in law enforcement 20 years, and I can tell you right now there's no way your mom is running around with the Green Berets. Especially not someone like her." The last words dripped with something more venomous than disbelief. Imani's stomach twisted as the meaning hit her. He wasn't just saying she was wrong. He was saying her mother didn't fit the image in his head because she was a black woman. Heat rose up her neck, her ears burning, and though she wanted to snap back with everything she knew, her mom's medals, her discipline, the nights she had spent overseas, her throat locked. Around her, strangers lingered, pretending to browse but clearly eavesdropping, and the weight of their silence pressed on her shoulders like cement. Madison leaned close, whispering nervously, "Just ignore him. He doesn't know." But ignoring wasn't an option. Not when the man's smirk widened. Not when the laughter echoed in her mind like a slap. Imani's hands shook as she pushed the box harder into the shelf, the scraping sound loud in the tense aisle. She swallowed hard and whispered back, "Because it's true." The words trembled but carried strength anyway, and Madison squeezed her arm in support. But Harris's chuckle deepened, as though her courage was just another joke to him. He tilted his head, projecting his voice so others could hear. "See, that's what I'm talking about. Cute kid making up fantasies. My son used to say his dad was Spider-Man. Same thing. Funny, but not real." The comparison stung, but more than that, the injustice burned in her chest. Harris didn't stop at laughter. He leaned against the rack of hoodies with his badge flashing subtly under the fluorescent lights, the smirk never leaving his face. "Special Forces," he repeated with a condescending shake of his head, his voice carrying enough volume for everyone within earshot to hear. "Kid, I've worked with real heroes, seen real sacrifice, and I can tell you right now your mom isn't one of them. Especially not someone like her." The words carried a venom that even at 12 years, old Imani could decode. He wasn't simply doubting her. He was dismissing her mother because she was a black woman, stripping away her truth with a laugh that suggested it was laughable for someone who looked like Angela Walker to be one of the best of the best. The sting hit Imani so hard she gripped the edges of the shoebox until her knuckles whitened. And though she wanted to shout that her mom had medals, commendations, and scars to prove it, the words caught in her throat. Madison glanced between the officer and her friend, eyes wide, tugging lightly on Imani's sleeve as if to warn her not to make things worse. "Just leave it, Imani," she whispered, her voice trembling as much as Imani's hands. But leaving it wasn't an option. Harris's laughter wasn't quiet or private. It was deliberate, meant to draw in the attention of strangers who now lingered longer in the aisle. The woman with the toddler was pretending to browse socks but had frozen, clearly watching. The teenagers leaned closer, whispering and chuckling as though enjoying a free show. A man near the clearance rack tilted his head, his frown betraying disapproval, yet he still said nothing. Silence wrapped around Imani like a trap, the kind of silence that says people are watching but no one will step in. Harris raised his chin, the smirk deepening as though he had already won. "Look," he continued, his voice booming with the false patience of an adult indulging a child's fantasy. "I get it. Kids want to believe their parents are superheroes. My boy once told his friends I was Batman. Cute stuff. But Special Forces? Green Berets? That's not something you hear at PTA meetings." His tone mocked not just her words, but the very idea that her truth could belong in the world of real possibilities. Imani felt her throat tighten, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the aisle could hear it, but something inside her refused to let the lie stand. "It's true," she said, her voice shaking but audible enough for the silence to break. "She is. My mom's in Special Forces." For a second the confidence faltered in Harris's expression, as though he hadn't expected her to push back, but it returned just as quickly, wrapped in another laugh. He clapped his hands lightly together as if he were at a comedy club. "That's exactly what I mean," he said, addressing not just Imani, but the strangers pretending not to watch. "Cute kid making up fairy tales. Sweetheart, there's nothing wrong with wanting your mom to be a hero, but you don't need to invent stories. Fairy tales are fun, but they're not real life." The word fairy tale struck Imani like a slap, louder than his laugh, sharper than his smirk. She thought of the medals in the wooden shadow box hanging in their living room, of the folded flag displayed in honor of fallen comrades her mother had told her about, of the nights her mom had left home knowing she might not return. None of that was a fairy tale. But here, in the bright aisles of a sporting goods store, with strangers staring, she could not summon proof. Her cheeks burned, her eyes stung, and she pressed her lips so tightly together they hurt. Madison touched her arm again, whispering desperately, "Please, just let's go. He doesn't matter." But Harris's grin widened, as though he could sense the battle tilting in his favor. "Tell you what," he said, his tone dripping with mock generosity. "If your mom really is in Special Forces, she should swing by the station sometime. We could use a laugh." The words triggered a ripple of chuckles from a couple of onlookers who quickly looked away, embarrassed, but not embarrassed enough to stop. Imani's body tensed as if a weight were pressing her down, her sneakers suddenly glued to the polished floor. She wanted to scream that her mom had faced dangers he could never imagine, that every laugh he delivered dishonored years of sacrifice, but her voice faltered under the smirk plastered across his face. The aisle seemed to close in, every eye watching her humiliation without lifting a finger to intervene. A woman near the yoga pants muttered under her breath, "She's just a kid," but the words were too soft to break the tension. Harris ignored it anyway. He tilted his head at Imani, his voice dropping lower but still carrying far enough. "Listen, sweetheart. You don't know what real sacrifice looks like. You're a little girl. It's better you learn the truth now than keep pretending." Madison gasped softly at the cruelty, her hand clutching Imani's sleeve tighter. The teenagers exchanged glances, clearly entertained by the scene. The man near the clearance rack shook his head again, muttering, "Let the kid be." But his voice was lost under Harris's next chuckle. The sound was colder now, filled not with amusement but with certainty. He believed he had crushed her, and in the way strangers shuffled uncomfortably but stayed silent, he almost had. Imani's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms until they hurt. Tears blurred her vision, but she forced them back, refusing to let him see her cry. "You don't know anything about her," she finally whispered, the words breaking through the lump in her throat. For the first time, Harris's smile faltered, but only for a heartbeat. Then he recovered, leaning back as if this were a show he had complete control over. "Sure, kid," he said dismissively. "Whatever you say." His tone carried the finality of a judge passing sentence, dismissing her truth with nothing more than a smirk and a laugh. He had reduced her mother's years of sacrifice, the medals on the wall, the long absences, and the quiet tears at night into a childish fantasy no more believable than Santa Claus. The insult stung deeper, because she could not fight it with proof. At home, she could point to the photos in uniform, the framed commendations, the folded flag gifted after funerals of comrades. Here, under the glaring lights of the store, all she had were words, and words felt flimsy against the laughter of a grown man in authority. Harris leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms like he was comfortable, as if the entire sneaker aisle was a stage. "See," he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear, "kids make things up. Nothing wrong with that. But stories are just stories. That's all." The two teenagers snickered behind their hands, whispering into each other's ears as they stole glances at Imani. A woman by the yoga pants rack shook her head with pity, but didn't speak up. Madison, wide-eyed, tugged desperately at Imani's sleeve, whispering, "Please, let's just wait outside. You don't have to prove anything." Imani wanted to move, wanted to leave, but her sneakers felt cemented to the shiny tile. Every instinct screamed at her to run, yet another instinct, stronger, kept her planted. This wasn't about sneakers anymore. This was about her mother's name, her mother's truth, and allowing a stranger's laughter to erase it felt worse than standing still in shame. Her chest tightened as though the air had thickened, but still she managed to whisper, "Because it's true," though the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. Harris chuckled again, shaking his head slowly, savoring her struggle like a predator toying with prey. "I've seen real soldiers," he said, his tone dripping with authority. "The guys who go overseas, the ones who put everything on the line. They don't look like your mom." The last words cut sharper than anything he had said before. It wasn't just out now, it was insult, targeted and cruel. Imani's eyes widened, her heart plummeting, and she knew everyone listening understood exactly what he meant. Madison gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth, whispering, "That's not fair, you don't even know her." Harris's gaze turned toward Madison, his smirk widening, and he mocked, "And you do? What, you two sit around swapping war stories at sleepovers? Please. I've worn a badge longer than you've been alive. I know what's real and what's not." Madison shrank back, but Imani clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Every nerve screamed in outrage, and even though her voice trembled, she forced herself to say louder, "You'll see. She's coming." The aisle fell quiet for a beat, every shopper frozen by the unexpected defiance. Harris barked a laugh, throwing his head back as though the child's words were the funniest thing he'd heard all week. "Sure she is," he taunted, rocking back on his heels. "Maybe she'll parachute through the skylight. Huh? That'd be a good show." His laughter rang out again, sharp, mocking, relentless, and the teenagers laughed with him. Imani's face burned, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. Every sound in the store seemed amplified, every whisper like a needle digging deeper into her skin. A woman nearby angled her phone discreetly, recording as though she were capturing a spectacle. A boy by the checkout pointed, nudging his friend to look. The humiliation pressed down harder than ever, suffocating in its weight, and for the first time Imani regretted speaking up at all. Maybe she should have kept her mom's life private, as her mother had always asked. Maybe she should have just said, "My mom's busy." But then she remembered the medals displayed in their living room, the stories her mom never told in detail, but carried in her eyes, the calloused hands that had held her through every fear. Those weren't fairy tales. That wasn't pretend. She whispered again, stronger this time. "You'll see." Harris leaned back, his arms crossed smugly, smiling like a man indulging a child. "All right then," he said mockingly. "I'll wait." The air in the aisle thickened with expectation, strangers shifting restlessly, as though watching the build-up of a scene in a play. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. It was as if the entire store had paused to watch the humiliation of a 12-year-old girl. Imani swallowed hard, her throat dry, her hands trembling at her sides, but she didn't back down. She couldn't. To retreat now would be to admit her truth was weak, and she knew it wasn't. Her heart hammered, so loud she thought it might burst, and she blinked away the tears that threatened to betray her. She thought again of her mother's steady stride, her commanding presence, the way she never needed to shout to command respect. She tried to borrow a piece of that strength, tried to stand taller even as shame gnawed at her insides. Madison whispered urgently, "Please, Imani, let's just go. You don't have to keep this up." But Imani shook her head minutely, whispering back, "I'm not lying." The officer's smirk only widened, but for the first time, there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, a flash so brief Imani almost missed it. He wasn't expecting her to resist this long. He thought his authority, his laugh, the weight of strangers' silence would crush her. And though she was breaking inside, her voice still carried the truth, and that truth, fragile though it felt, was the only weapon she had. Harris leaned closer again, lowering his voice just enough to feel like a secret, but loud enough for others to hear. "Better stop while you're ahead, sweetheart. People are going to laugh." "You're a sweet kid," he said with mock gentleness, his words dripping with poison. "But you don't know what real sacrifice looks like. You don't know what real heroes are. I've worked with the ones who've been overseas, who've risked their lives in combat, who've put it all on the line, and trust me, they don't look like your mom." The cruelty in his voice was unmistakable, a thinly veiled strike at her mother's race and gender. And though he didn't say the words outright, everyone listening knew exactly what he meant. A ripple of unease passed through the small crowd, the mother with the toddler shifting uncomfortably, the teenagers exchanging glances, their smirks dimming for the first time, and Madison stepping closer to Imani with her hands shaking slightly as she tugged at her friend's arm. "Stop," Madison whispered desperately, her voice cracking. "Please, let's go." He's not going to listen. But Imani's feet felt glued to the ground, her pride battling with her fear, her mother's face flashing in her mind, the long hours she had spent staring at the medals in their living room, the countless nights she cried herself to sleep because her mom was away. None of that was a fairy tale. None of it was pretend. Every memory screamed that the man in front of her was wrong, and yet the way he twisted his words made it feel like the world was tilting against her. Harris leaned closer still, lowering his voice so that it was intimate enough to sting, but loud enough that the entire aisle could still hear every syllable. "The truth, kid, is that people laugh when they hear nonsense. And that's what this is, nonsense. You say your mom's in special forces? Cute story, but not real. You're setting yourself up for humiliation. And one day, you'll learn that pretending doesn't make anything true." Imani's chest burned. Her fists clenched so tight her nails dug into her skin, and the sting in her eyes nearly betrayed her with tears. She thought of her mom's steady words at bedtime. Courage isn't about not being scared. Courage is speaking when your voice shakes. And now her voice shook so badly she almost couldn't hear it herself. But she still forced out the words, "You're wrong. You don't know anything about her." For the first time, Harris's face twitched, his smirk faltering. But he covered it quickly with a harsh laugh, turning to the crowd as if seeking agreement. "There it is again," he said with mock amusement, his words thrown into the air for everyone nearby. "A fantasy. Look, I don't blame her. We all want heroes in our lives. But facts are facts. And facts don't bend because a kid wants her mom to sound important." His chuckle drew a few uneasy laughs from bystanders, though most looked away now, the cruelty hitting harder than before. Still, no one stepped forward to defend Imani, and their silence wrapped around her like another layer of shame. Madison's hand gripped her arm tighter, her whisper harsh, "He's just being mean. Please stop talking to him." But Imani shook her head, her lips trembling as she repeated louder this time, "You'll see. She's coming." Harris raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning like armor. "She's coming. Huh? What's she going to do? March in here and prove me wrong? I'll believe it when I see it." He leaned back, crossing his arms smugly, rocking on his heels like a man certain of his victory. The tension in the aisle grew unbearable, a suffocating weight pressing on everyone. A man in a baseball cap muttered, "Just let the kid talk, man." But his voice was low, drowned by the officer's dismissive laughter. Imani swallowed hard, forcing herself not to cry, forcing herself to stand straighter even as the weight of the moment tried to crush her. The humiliation seared through her body, but beneath it was a fire she didn't recognize, a defiance stronger than her shame. She imagined her mom's boots striking pavement, her commanding presence in airports, the way she carried herself without apology. Imani tried to channel that strength now, even as her chest tightened and her palms slicked with sweat. "I don't care if you believe me," she said suddenly, her voice louder than she expected, carrying enough weight to silence a few whispers around them. "My mom doesn't need your approval." The words hung in the air, sharp and defiant, and for a moment Harris blinked, caught off guard. But then he laughed again, shaking his head slowly. "That's adorable," he said, his tone both mocking and cruel. "But the world doesn't work on feelings, kid. The world works on truth. And the truth is, you made it up." His words struck like a hammer, pounding humiliation deeper into her chest, and the crowd's silence made it sting worse. The teenagers glanced at each other, suddenly less amused, as though unsure now whether the laughter was still safe. The woman with the toddler shook her head, whispering something under her breath, and Madison stared at the floor, her face pale with fear. Imani's heart pounded so loud she thought everyone could hear it, but she clenched her jaw and whispered one more time, steady and deliberate, "You'll see." Harris tilted his head, folding his arms, smiling like he'd wrapped up the case. The store's air conditioner hummed overhead, the music from the speakers played faintly, but all of it was drowned by the heaviness of people standing around, whispering to themselves, watching her like she was part of a show. The mother with the toddler gripped the cart tighter, looking torn between pity and avoidance, while the two teenagers leaned on the rack with sly grins, whispering under their breath like the cruelty was amusing. A man in a baseball cap muttered something about letting the kid be, but his voice never rose, his words lost in the aisle before they could matter. Every second of silence felt like another stone piling onto Imani's back. She wished anyone would stand up for her, but all she saw were eyes shifting away when she looked too long, people pretending to browse jerseys or sneakers, their shame hidden behind false distraction. Harris thrived in that silence, leaning back with his arms crossed as though he had an audience he fully controlled. He gestured lazily toward Imani, his tone dripping with mock patience. "See, this is what happens when kids make things up. Nothing wrong with imagination, but when it gets this far, people laugh. That's life. Better she learns it now." His words cut deeper because they echoed off the silence, each one sinking into the still air without challenge. Imani's fists clenched tighter at her sides, her nails digging into her palms until they stung, her whole body trembling from the weight of shame and defiance colliding inside her. She could feel Madison's hand on her sleeve again, pulling gently, her voice a whisper trembling with fear. "Please, Imani, please let's go outside. You don't have to keep this up. He's just being mean. Don't let him win." But leaving meant surrender. Leaving meant letting his laughter stand as truth. Leaving meant shrinking in front of strangers who already doubted her. And Imani's chest burned at the thought of walking away. She remembered her mom's steady words whenever she cried at night. Courage isn't loud. It's standing tall when you want to shrink. She felt smaller than she had ever felt before, but that small voice inside her refused to die. She lifted her chin slightly, her eyes glossy but unbroken, and whispered again with more strength than before, "You'll see." The officer smirked wider, like her resistance amused him even more. "We'll see," he repeated, chuckling as though the phrase itself was a punchline. "All right then, sweetheart, let's see. I'll wait right here. Maybe your big hero mom will walk in and prove me wrong." He rocked back on his heels, folding his arms, his grin fixed, as if he were certain of victory. The silence that followed was suffocating. The entire sneaker aisle had transformed into a stage, the shoppers into an audience holding their breath, waiting to see if the little girl would break. Imani's chest rose and fell quickly, her breath shallow, her heart pounding like a drum, but she stood still. Every second of stillness felt like an eternity, her shame and anger battling for control. But through it all her voice echoed inside her mind. "You'll see." The officer tapped his badge with a mocking smile, adding, "Tell you what, kid, if your mom really is what you say, I'll buy you those sneakers myself. But until then, maybe keep the fairy tales at home." The word struck like another slap, the word fairy tale ringing in her skull again, but she refused to look away. Tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them back, unwilling to give him the satisfaction. A woman standing nearby finally whispered to her friend, "She's just a kid." But again the words were too quiet, drowned under the weight of silence that no one dared to break loudly. Madison pressed her hand against Imani's, whispering desperately, "He doesn't matter, Imani. You know the truth. I know the truth. That's enough." But it didn't feel like enough. Not when strangers watched, not when Harris's laughter rang in her ears, not when his smirk told her that he believed he had already crushed her. It wasn't just about knowing the truth, it was about seeing it recognized. And as Imani's chest heaved with the effort of holding herself together, she realized that the silence of the crowd was a kind of cruelty too, a cruelty made of fear and indifference. Nobody wanted to risk embarrassment or confrontation, so they let hers stretch longer, piling onto her shoulders. Harris shifted his weight like he was settling into comfort, glancing around the aisle with satisfaction, speaking louder than needed. "Look at her. Stubborn. That's cute. But reality doesn't change just because you repeat yourself. The world's tough, and better she learns it now." His words washed over her, sharp as knives, but inside Imani's heart another flame flickered. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. She thought of her mother's boots, the medals displayed, the commanding way her mom walked into any room, and she imagined all of that standing behind her in this moment, even if her mother wasn't here yet. She whispered again, her voice trembling but unbroken, "You'll see." The silence still suffocated Imani, every second stretching like an eternity as Harris leaned back smugly against the rack of hoodies with his arms folded, grinning like the outcome had already been decided. But while he basked in his false victory, footsteps were echoing across the polished mall floor, steady and commanding, boots striking tile with a rhythm that had carried through countless bases and missions. Sergeant Major Angela Walker was already inside the building, her camouflage uniform crisp from the ceremony she had just left at Fort Bragg, her beret tucked under one arm, her medals catching the fluorescent light, her presence drawing instinctive respect from strangers who didn't even know her name. She had not come expecting confrontation. She had only intended to surprise her daughter with an early pickup, but as she crossed the food court and stepped toward the wide entrance of Dick's Sporting Goods, the murmur of unease and the unnatural gathering of a crowd in the sneaker aisle pulled her focus. Angela's eyes narrowed, scanning quickly with the sharpness of a soldier trained to read situations before they exploded. She saw the people standing stiffly with their arms crossed, whispering, pointing phones discreetly, and then she saw her daughter in the middle of it all, small, trembling, fists clenched at her sides, her face blotched with humiliation, yet holding her chin just high enough to show defiance. Angela's pace slowed for half a heartbeat, her chest tightening at the sight of tears in Imani's eyes, but then her stride lengthened, her boots striking louder, sharper, as she cut through the crowd with an authority no one needed explained. Every shopper instinctively moved aside as she approached, not because she demanded it with words, but because the gravity of her presence commanded it. She was the kind of woman who carried entire missions on her back, and now carried the weight of her daughter's humiliation as if it were heavier than any battlefield. Imani's heart pounded when she caught sight of her mother turning the corner, and for a moment relief rushed through her so quickly she nearly cried out. But alongside relief came a knot of fear, because now her mother was going to see everything, every laugh, every insult, every tear she had fought to keep from falling. Harris spotted her too, at first only seeing a woman in uniform and assuming she was another shopper, his grin unshaken. But as Angela drew closer, the rank insignia on her sleeve came into view, the medals across her chest undeniable, and for the first time his smirk faltered, just slightly, before he caught himself. He tried to straighten his stance, clearing his throat, as if he had not been mocking a child moments before, but the shift in the crowd betrayed him, eyes darting from him to Angela, whispers spreading like fire. "She's real," a boy muttered at the checkout, his friend elbowing him with wide eyes. "That's her mom," someone else whispered, awe creeping into their tone. Imani's lips trembled, her voice cracking louder than she meant as she blurted, "Mom." The word cut through the aisle like a blade, silencing even the officer's chuckle, and in that moment the balance shifted. Angela moved directly to her daughter, her hand resting firmly on Imani's shoulder, her expression calm, but her eyes burning with the kind of fire that came from years of battlefields and injustices both foreign and domestic. "What's going on?" she asked evenly, her voice low but carrying, the tone of a leader who expected an answer. The crowd seemed to lean in collectively, the tension so thick it nearly hummed. Imani swallowed hard, her shame spilling out in trembling words. "He said you couldn't be who you are, that I made it up." She pointed toward Harris, the tears finally spilling over, half desperation, half vindication. Angela didn't respond immediately. She let silence stretch just long enough to force Harris into discomfort. He gave a nervous laugh, rubbing the back of his neck, muttering, "Kids, you know how they are. Big imaginations. I was just having a little fun with her." But Angela's gaze locked on him like steel, and when she spoke again, her voice was even, sharp, and cutting. "You mocked my daughter in front of strangers and called her a liar." Harris's shoulders stiffened, his forced grin faltering. "Now hold on, I didn't call her that," he said quickly. "I just said she repeated the truth," Angela interrupted smoothly, her words precise as a blade. "And you decided it was a joke. Tell me, officer, what exactly made it so funny?" The deliberate use of his title made him twitch, the badge on his belt suddenly heavier under the fluorescent lights. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. A few people nodded. A teenage boy near the checkout muttered, "She's the real thing." The teenagers who had chuckled earlier shifted uncomfortably, their amusement gone. Imani straightened slightly under her mother's touch, the crushing weight of humiliation lifting, replaced with a pride that surged so quickly it nearly stole her breath. Harris cleared his throat again, fumbling. "Look, Sergeant Major, with all due respect," but Angela raised a hand slightly, her voice slicing clean through his excuse. "Respect doesn't begin with laughter at a child." The store fell silent, even the overhead music seeming muted, as though the air itself had paused to listen. The authority in her tone required no yelling, no theatrics. It was simply there, undeniable. Harris shifted again, his bravado draining by degrees, but he tried to salvage ground, muttering, "I didn't mean anything by it. I just thought it was unusual, that's all." Angela tilted her head, her expression calm, but her words laced with steel. "Unusual doesn't mean impossible. It means you've never seen it. And maybe the problem is less about me being here and more about you never imagining I could be." Her voice carried not just to him, but to everyone within earshot. And as the words landed, a wave of nods and murmurs moved through the shoppers. The woman with the toddler whispered, "She's right," and the man in the baseball cap gave a sharp nod. His smirk, once easy and cruel, now twitched nervously at the edges, but pride forced him to hold on to it even as beads of sweat formed near his hairline. Angela did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence carried the kind of command that came from years of making life and death decisions. And now that authority zeroed in on the man who had mocked her daughter. "Officer," she said evenly, each syllable deliberate, "my daughter tells me you laughed at her when she spoke the truth." Harris cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably, but tried to maintain his swagger. "Now look, Sergeant Major, with all due respect, I was just trying to lighten the mood. Kids exaggerate. I didn't mean any harm." Angela's gaze didn't waver, her eyes steady and unblinking, as if she could see through every word. "Exaggerating is saying your mom makes the best cookies in the world. Exaggerating is telling your friends you can run faster than a car. My daughter did not exaggerate. She told you who I am, and you decided to mock her." Her words sliced through the air, sharper than any raised voice could be, and the weight of them made Harris falter. His grin weakened, and he opened his mouth as though to respond, but Angela pressed forward with the precision of a soldier closing in on the truth. "Tell me, officer, what exactly made it so funny? That she spoke with pride? Or that the idea of me in this uniform, in this rank, in this role, was too much for you to imagine?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the woman with the toddler whispering something to the man beside her. The teenagers glancing at each other awkwardly now, no longer amused, but uneasy under the heavy air. Harris shifted again, his eyes darting to the badge on his belt as if it could rescue him. "You're putting words in my mouth. I never said anything about race, never said anything about women." Angela leaned in slightly, her voice low, but carrying with steel. "You didn't have to. Your laugh said it for you." A few shoppers nodded openly now, one man muttering, "She's right," his voice loud enough to be heard this time. Harris's face flushed, his forced grin breaking into something thinner, and for the first time, he looked like a man on the defensive. Imani's heart soared in her chest, pride washing over her humiliation as she watched her mother dismantle every piece of the cruelty she had endured minutes before. The officer, who had loomed so large in her fear, now seemed smaller, shrinking under the weight of truth spoken calmly and firmly. Harris tried one last desperate attempt at defense. "I told you, I didn't mean any harm. It just caught me off guard. Special forces? I've never seen anything like that, that's all." Angela tilted her head, her expression unreadable, but her words cutting like glass. "Unusual doesn't mean impossible. It means you lack the imagination. You saw my daughter's pride, and instead of listening, you decided to laugh. You turned her truth into entertainment." She shifted slightly, her hand still on Imani's shoulder, grounding her, reminding her daughter that this fight was not hers to carry alone anymore. "The truth doesn't need your permission to exist, Officer Harris, and it certainly doesn't need your laughter." The silence that followed was no longer suffocating. It was heavy with justice, heavy with recognition, heavy with the realization of every bystander that they were witnessing a man stripped of arrogance by nothing more than calm, undeniable truth. The crowd leaned in now, phones held higher, recording openly as Harris's face reddened. His earlier bravado had evaporated, leaving him exposed. His arms crossed not out of confidence, but as a shield against the humiliation now aimed at him. Imani stood taller beside her mother, the shame that had weighed her moments before dissolving into pride that made her chest swell. She whispered under her breath, almost to herself, "She's amazing." Angela heard it, squeezing her daughter's shoulder gently without looking down, her gaze never leaving Harris. "Next time you laugh at a child, remember this moment," she said quietly, the calmness of her tone making the words even sharper. "Respect costs you nothing, but its absence can wound deeper than you realize." Harris swallowed hard, his throat visibly bobbing, his voice faltering as he muttered, "All right, point taken." But his mutter was not enough for the crowd, not enough for Angela, and certainly not enough for the child he had mocked. The woman with the toddler shook her head, saying louder now, "That's not an apology," and the crowd murmured in agreement. Harris's face burned deeper red, his mouth working as though he had swallowed something sour. But Angela stood unmoving, her authority unshaken, her eyes locked on his. Imani could feel the shift, could feel the power no longer in the laughter that had mocked her, but in the truth her mother had carried into the room. Harris was cornered now, cornered not by force, but by dignity, and no amount of smirking could save him from it. The store, once filled with whispers and cruel chuckles, was now filled with silence heavy with anticipation, silence waiting for something more. Angela did not speak again, but the weight of her stillness forced Harris to fidget, his hands tightening around his crossed arms, his foot tapping restlessly on the floor. The crowd's silence was not with him anymore. It was against him. He felt it, and so did Imani, who lifted her chin higher, her pride finally blooming through the cracks of her earlier humiliation. Harris gave a nervous chuckle, the sound thin and brittle. The crowd was leaning toward Angela, not with fear, but with respect, their eyes following her every move, their phones angled slightly higher, capturing the confrontation as if they sensed history was being made in this ordinary mall on an ordinary Saturday. Angela did not need to raise her voice, because she knew that true power often whispered, and yet the words she spoke struck with the force of a hammer. "Unusual doesn't mean impossible," she repeated firmly, her eyes locked on Harris, her hand steady on Imani's shoulder. "It means you never imagined it could be. And maybe that is not a reflection on me, but on you." The crowd murmured in agreement, the man in the baseball cap nodding emphatically, the woman with the toddler muttering, "That's right," under her breath. Harris tried to clear his throat, as if preparing to respond, but Angela pressed forward with precision, her every word dismantling the fragile wall of excuses he had tried to build. "My daughter spoke the truth, and you, a grown man with a badge no less, decided to mock her in front of strangers, to strip her of pride and make her voice sound like a lie. Tell me, officer, is that the example of authority you want to leave behind? To laugh at children when their truth doesn't fit your imagination?" Harris's face reddened deeper, his lips pressing together in a thin line as the murmurs of the crowd rose. The silence had turned into judgment now, judgment not against Imani, but against him. And the shift made him flinch. He muttered, "I told you I didn't mean anything by it." His voice thin, his earlier confidence vanished. Angela didn't blink. "Intent doesn't erase impact," she said smoothly. She stood here, alone, while you used her pride as your punchline. Do you have any idea what that does to a child? What it feels like to carry the weight of a room's laughter when you know you are telling the truth? Imani's heart swelled in her chest as her mother spoke, the words echoing everything she had wanted to say, but could not. She blinked quickly, forcing the tears back. But this time, they were not tears of shame. They were tears of pride, pride that her mother was saying the things she could not find the courage to speak. Harris rubbed the back of his neck, shifting his weight, glancing nervously at the crowd now fully against him. "Fine," he muttered weakly. "Maybe I came across wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have laughed. But I didn't say anything about race or gender. You're putting words in my mouth." Angela leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing, her voice still calm, but carrying enough force to silence even the whispers. "You didn't have to say it. Your laugh said it for you. Your smirk said it. Your dismissal said it. My daughter stood here proud of me, and instead of listening, you reduced her to a joke. That isn't about her words. That's about your assumptions." A ripple of nods moved through the crowd. A man near the checkout counter muttered, "She's right," his voice louder than before. Harris's jaw flexed as though he wanted to argue, but the weight of the crowd pressing in and the unwavering stare of Angela left him trapped. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Angela straightened again, her hand firm on Imani's shoulder, grounding her daughter in pride. "I have served my country for 22 years. I have led soldiers into terrain you will never see, made decisions that carried life and death, borne scars that no one outside the uniform will ever understand. I wear these stripes because I earned them, every one of them. And yet the hardest battle I fight is not overseas. It is here, convincing people like you that my existence is not a joke." Her voice, steady and unshaken, carried through the store like a current. Shoppers who had remained silent earlier now shifted with visible discomfort, not because they disagreed, but because they recognized themselves in the silence that had let the laughter stretch as long as it had. The woman with the toddler exhaled sharply and whispered to her friend, "She's incredible." The teenagers who had laughed earlier stared at their shoes, suddenly ashamed, their smirks gone completely. Imani stood straighter beside her mother, her chin lifting, the fire in her chest growing brighter as the shame that had once buried her dissolved into something stronger. Harris swallowed hard, his shoulders sagging under the invisible weight pressing down on him. "All right," he said finally, his voice strained, his eyes flicking nervously toward the crowd of strangers holding him accountable. Point taken. But Angela didn't release him. Her gaze remained firm, her words deliberate. Point taken is not enough. Because this was never about you. This was about her. You mocked her. You called her truth a fairy tale. You turned her pride into your entertainment. So if you want to make this right, you don't look at me, you look at her." Harris froze, his eyes flicking toward Imani, who stared back, her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes wet but unflinching. For the first time, the officer looked smaller than the girl he had tried to belittle. His voice faltered, muttering, "Sorry, kid." But the murmurs of the crowd rose instantly, voices sharp with disapproval. "That's not enough," someone said. "Say it properly," another added. Angela's gaze sharpened and she arched a brow. "Try again." Harris's face flushed crimson, sweat beading at his temple as the crowd's silence bore down on him, demanding more. He cleared his throat, forcing the words out louder this time. "Imani, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have laughed at you. I shouldn't have said what I said. You told the truth, and I didn't believe you. That was wrong." The words, awkward and heavy, hung in the air, but for the first time, they were real. Imani's chest swelled with pride, her heart racing, her humiliation lifting as she held his gaze for a moment before looking up at her mother. Angela gave the slightest nod, a signal that the truth had been restored. The officer shifted, clearly desperate for the ground to swallow him. But the crowd was not finished listening, and Angela was not finished speaking. She turned to the aisle, her voice carrying to everyone now. This is not just about one man and one child. It is about what happens when assumptions are treated as fact, when laughter replaces listening, when the truth of someone's life is dismissed because it does not fit a narrow picture. My daughter's truth was simple, but it was easier to assume she was lying than to imagine it could be real. Angela's eyes remained steady on him, sharp and unyielding, her hand still firm on Imani's shoulder, grounding her daughter with strength as she pressed forward with words that left no room for escape. "That is not an apology," she said calmly, her voice cutting clean through the weight of the moment. "That is you trying to save face. An apology is not about you. It is about the person you harmed. You mocked my daughter, you called her truth a fairy tale, and you turned her pride into your entertainment. If you want to apologize, you look at her, not at me." Harris's throat bobbed visibly, his eyes darting to Imani and then away again, his pride battling with the humiliation pressing down on him. He had built his life around authority, around the badge that now felt heavier than it ever had, and to be forced to bend under the gaze of strangers, to be forced to apologize to a 12-year-old black girl he had ridiculed, was a wound to his ego deeper than anything he had expected when he first laughed. Yet the silence of the crowd demanded it, their eyes heavy on him, their voices murmuring in agreement with Angela, their judgment pressing him into a corner he could not escape. Finally, with his shoulders sagging and his face flushed crimson, he cleared his throat and forced his eyes toward Imani. "I'm sorry, kid," he muttered again. The murmurs rose instantly, voices sharper now. "Not good enough. Say it properly. She deserves better." Angela arched a brow, her expression unchanged, but her silence loud with expectation. Harris shifted, fidgeting with his arms still folded, then slowly unfolded them, his hands awkward at his sides, his voice trembling slightly now. "Imani," he began, his tone louder, his words deliberate. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have laughed at you. I shouldn't have said what I said. You told the truth, and I didn't believe you. That was wrong. I hurt you when I should have listened. I'm sorry." The words landed heavy in the air, awkward but real, a confession dragged from a man who had run out of defenses. The crowd responded this time not with murmurs, but with a silence that felt approving, a silence that acknowledged that something had shifted, that a wrong had been acknowledged even if it could not be erased. Imani stood frozen for a moment, her chest tight, her eyes wet, but this time the tears that threatened were not of shame, but of release. For once she did not feel like shrinking, did not feel like the floor was pulling her down. Instead, she felt taller, her chin lifting slightly as she met his gaze, unflinching. And in that second, the power that had been stolen from her with laughter was returned in full. Angela gave a small nod, the kind of subtle signal only a mother could give, and the weight that had been crushing Imani lifted like a stone rolled away. Harris exhaled sharply, as though hoping that would end things, but Angela was not finished. She turned her gaze back to the crowd, her voice carrying evenly but firmly. "This is not about one man and one child," she said, speaking not just to Harris, but to every person who had stood silently moments before. "This is about what happens when people decide their assumptions matter more than the truth. My daughter stood here with pride in her voice, and instead of being heard, she was laughed at. How many times does that happen? How many times do children grow up thinking their voices don't matter because someone with power decided to laugh instead of listen?" Her words rippled through the store like a current, touching every listener. The woman with the toddler nodded, whispering, "She's right." The teenagers who had smirked earlier shifted uncomfortably, their expressions sheepish now, shame creeping into their eyes. The man in the baseball cap gave a firm nod, his voice louder this time. "Exactly right." Imani felt Madison's hand squeeze hers tightly, whispering, "She's amazing." And for the first time since the ordeal began, Imani smiled faintly, pride swelling in her chest, so strongly it nearly drowned out everything else. Angela's gaze softened slightly as she looked down at her daughter, speaking not just for the crowd, but for Imani herself. "You never have to be ashamed of telling the truth," she said gently, her voice carrying strength and tenderness together. "Not when it's about me, not about anything. If someone can't handle it, that is their weakness, not yours." Imani swallowed hard, her chest tightening with pride, her tears finally spilling over. But they were tears of relief now, tears of vindication, tears of freedom. She nodded quickly, whispering, "I promise," though her voice trembled. Harris stood awkwardly, his apology given, his smirk destroyed, his authority shredded by the calm dignity of the woman before him and the strength of the child he had mocked. He muttered softly, "I already said I was sorry," as though hoping it would close the moment, but Angela looked at him one last time, her voice even and sharp. "Then live like it. Next time you meet a child with pride in their voice, don't strip it away. Let them keep it. Because once you take that from a child, it's not easily given back." Her words cut through the air like a final judgment, and the silence that followed was not empty, but heavy with meaning. A young man near the checkout clapped once, the sound echoing, and within seconds others joined, the applause spreading through the store, not rowdy, but steady and supportive, a recognition that something powerful had just taken place. Harris's face burned crimson, his posture sagging as he gave a stiff nod and stepped back, retreating toward the edge of the aisle, no longer the man in control, but the man who had been schooled in front of strangers. Imani turned to her mother, her voice small but steady. "Thank you." Angela bent down slightly so that her face was level with her daughter's. "No, Imani," she said softly, her eyes warm with pride. "Thank you for telling the truth when it wasn't easy. That's braver than anything I've ever done in uniform." The applause faded into a hum of whispers and quiet footsteps as the crowd slowly dispersed, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air like smoke after fire, impossible to ignore and unwilling to dissipate quickly. Imani stood beside her mother, her small frame no longer trembling with fear but lifted with pride, her head held higher than it had been all afternoon. The sting of humiliation that had burned her cheeks minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a warmth that came from vindication, from the undeniable presence of truth standing beside her in uniform. Officer Harris retreated toward the exit with his shoulders sagging, his earlier bravado stripped away, his smirk erased, his authority hollow in the face of a lesson he had been forced to absorb in front of strangers. Every step he took away from the aisle felt like an admission of defeat, the kind that no badge could cover and no excuse could soften. For once, the silence was no longer cruel. It was contemplative, filled with the quiet murmur of people carrying the memory of what they had seen. Angela turned to her daughter, her voice soft but firm. "You all right?" Imani nodded quickly, wiping her face with the back of her hand, her tears finally dry. "Yeah," she whispered, "I just hate that it happened." Angela's hand rested lightly on her daughter's shoulder, grounding her once more. "I know," she said gently, "but sometimes moments like this teach us more than 100 quiet days ever could. You don't forget them, and neither does anyone who watched." This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who stayed silent. And it was about you learning that your voice is stronger than their silence. Imani's chest swelled with something new, not just relief, but strength, a strength she hadn't known she carried until it was tested. Madison stepped forward, her voice shaky but sincere. "She's amazing, Imani." Everyone was listening to her. "And you too. You didn't give in." Imani smiled faintly, pride stirring in her chest as her mother gave a small nod, confirming what her friend had said. Angela looked down at her daughter again, her words deliberate. "Never let anyone tell you your truth doesn't matter. Not me, not him, not anyone. Promise me that." Imani looked up, her eyes shining, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling in her throat. "I promise." Angela leaned down, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead, the simple gesture more powerful than any speech. Around them, a few shoppers lingered, pretending to browse but stealing glances with admiration instead of ridicule now. A man in a baseball cap spoke up louder than before, his voice clear. "Ma'am, thank you. I've got a daughter myself. She's 9. I hope she grows up with that kind of courage." Angela met his eyes with a small nod. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about speaking anyway. If she learns that, she'll be stronger than most adults ever will. The man nodded, his face thoughtful, and the weight of her words seemed to land not just on him, but on everyone within earshot. Imani felt the lesson etching itself into her heart, carving strength where shame had once threatened to hollow her out. As they walked toward the exit together, Angela's boots striking steady against the tile, people still glanced at them, but the looks were different now. No longer mocking, no longer doubtful, but filled with respect, quiet admiration, and maybe even a little guilt for having stayed silent. The mall outside buzzed with normalcy, shoppers carrying bags, food court chatter, children tugging at parents. But for Imani, the world felt altered. The lesson burned into her memory forever. She realized that even though the moment had been one of the hardest of her young life, it had also been one of the most important. She had faced humiliation, prejudice, and doubt, and she had not broken. She had spoken even when her voice shook. And when her mother appeared, the truth she had clung to shone brighter than all the smirks and laughter combined. In the car, as they buckled their seat belts, Angela glanced into the rearview mirror, her voice softer now, but carrying the same strength. "People will doubt you. They'll laugh, dismiss you, try to make you smaller. But you never let them take your truth. Not for me. Not for anyone. Promise me again, Imani." The girl smiled, her heart steady, her pride unshakable now. "I promise, Mom." Angela started the car, the hum of the engine filling the brief silence. Madison squeezed Imani's hand from the back seat, whispering, "Told you he was wrong." Imani laughed softly for the first time that day, the sound light unburdened, and she nodded. "Yeah, you did." They drove away, the mall fading behind them, but the memory remained, not just for them, but for every person who had stood in that aisle, watching, recording, whispering. Each of them would carry away the image of a black mother in uniform, a daughter standing beside her, and the undeniable truth that respect costs nothing, but withholding it can scar someone deeply. Imani leaned her head back against the seat, her heart lighter than it had been in hours, and thought, "I'll never be embarrassed about Mom again." The words settled inside her like a vow, a promise not just to her mother, but to herself. And somewhere inside the walls of that mall, the echoes of Angela's voice lingered like a ghostly reminder, whispering into the ears of strangers who had learned something they hadn't expected to learn that day. Life has a way of placing people in moments they never asked for, moments that test whether they will shrink or stand tall, whether they will laugh cruelly or listen carefully, whether they will dismiss someone's truth or respect it. For Imani, that lesson was now carved into her heart forever. For Harris, the humiliation would follow him, a constant reminder of the day his laughter was dismantled by calm authority and undeniable truth. And for the crowd, the silence they had chosen would remain a weight in their memory, a lesson about the cost of standing by when someone else is diminished the end. If this story moved you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the plot. Did the officer get what he deserved? And what did you think about the way Angela stood up for her daughter? Drop your opinion in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because your perspective makes these stories even more powerful.